There is a disturbing question hidden in the silent chambers of the sleeping mind. What would you do if one night, in the depths of an ordinary dream, you suddenly heard yourself speaking fluently in a language you have never learned, never studied, never consciously encountered? No subtitles, no translation, only the strange, undeniable certainty that the words made sense inside the dream. A voice emerged from your own mind, articulate, precise, foreign, and yet intimately familiar. But how is this possible? Is the brain capable of creating a language from nothing? Is this a buried memory, a fragmented echo, or something far more unsettling, a part of the mind that thinks in symbols older than words? Tonight we enter one of the most haunting experiences of human consciousness, the phenomenon of dreaming in languages you do not speak. A phenomenon that blurs the borders between memory, imagination, and the hidden architecture of the sleeping brain. And once you understand what's really happening, you may never hear your own inner voice the same way again. Dreaming in a language you don't speak is not as rare as it sounds, and that's what makes it so disturbing. Across cultures, laboratories, and sleep clinics, people have reported remarkably similar experiences. They fall asleep with no knowledge of a foreign language, and inside the dream, they suddenly understand, speak, or hear words that feel structured, meaningful, and emotionally coherent. Sometimes the language sounds real, like French, Arabic, or Japanese. Other times it feels entirely unfamiliar, not gibberish, but something that feels internally logical, like a private linguistic world built only for that dream. This phenomenon sits at a strange crossroads between memory, imagination, and symbolic cognition. And it raises a terrifyingly elegant question. Does the brain need actual linguistic knowledge to create the experience of language? Dream language isn't about vocabulary stored in conscious memory. It's about the feeling of understanding, a sensation that something makes semantic sense, even if the waking mind cannot translate it afterward. To the dreaming brain, meaning doesn't come from textbooks or grammar rules. It comes from emotion, context, and symbolic architecture. In these dreams, communication often feels more vivid than waking speech. Words seem to bypass logic and go straight into understanding. You don't translate, you simply know. This makes the phenomenon deeply unsettling for neuroscientists and psychologists because it suggests the brain might have a pre-linguistic structure for meaning, something that exists beneath spoken language. And this connects to a much larger truth about dreaming. Dreams are not stories we create. They are worlds we enter, worlds where the brain doesn't need real fluency to simulate the experience of fluent thought, worlds where language becomes emotion and emotion becomes language. In the next part, we'll dive into the psychological machinery behind this and why the mind is capable of generating the illusion of new languages with such terrifying precision. To understand why the mind can dream in languages it doesn't consciously know, we need to enter the architecture of the unconscious. The dreaming brain does not operate like the waking brain. It does not retrieve information in neat logical categories. Instead, it works through associations, emotional memory, and symbolic construction. When you dream of speaking a foreign language, you are not inventing grammar or vocabulary in a traditional sense. You are experiencing the brain's ability to simulate meaning without words. Psychologists call this semantic hallucination, the sensation of understanding something that does not rely on known symbols. In waking life, language works from the outside in. You hear words, your brain decodes them, meaning emerges. But in dreams, it works the opposite way. Meaning arises first, and the brain builds something that feels like language to carry it. This is because dreams are driven by affective cognition, thought shaped by emotion, memory fragments, and symbolic memory. The mind builds entire scenes not from logic, but from psychological relevance. When someone dreams in an unknown language, what's really happening is this. The brain wants to express complex emotional or symbolic meaning, but instead of using images alone, it activates the experience of language, the rhythm, structure, tone, and intention of speech, without requiring real linguistic data. This is tied to something called cryptomnesia, hidden memories we don't consciously recall but still influence our mental world. Your brain has heard fragments of languages your whole life, from movies, from music, from background conversations, from digital content. Even if you can't consciously reproduce those words, your unconscious has stored patterns, phonetics, and cadence. In dreams, these patterns are freed from logical constraints. They combine, they distort, they reorganize, and suddenly, your mind creates a language-shaped experience that feels real. There is also a strong link to identity fluidity in dreams. In REM sleep, the brain temporarily loosens the boundaries of the self. You are not just you in dreams, you become roles, observers, strangers, archetypes. Language becomes part of that transformation. When you speak a foreign language in a dream, you are not just changing your words. You are psychologically entering a different version of yourself, a version of you that isn't limited by education, culture, or waking identity. The brain constructs these moments because it is rehearsing emotional complexity. Dreams are simulations, not of reality, but of possible states of being. And foreign dream languages are one of the purest forms of that simulation, because they show us something terrifying and beautiful. The mind does not need to know in order to experience knowing. In the next part, we'll move from psychology to the physical brain and explore what happens neurologically when this phenomenon unfolds inside REM sleep. Inside the sleeping brain, this phenomenon is not mystical. It is electrical, chemical, and deeply biological. Dreams that involve speaking unfamiliar languages emerge primarily during REM sleep, the phase where the brain is paradoxically more active than when we are awake. During REM, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for logic, self-monitoring, and reality checking, becomes significantly less active. At the same time, the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, becomes hyperactive. This creates a neurological environment where emotion overrides rational structure. In waking life, language production is tightly controlled by regions like Broca's area, speech production, Wernicke's area, language comprehension, the angular gyrus, semantic processing. In dreams, these areas are not offline. They are dysregulated and hyperconnected. This means the brain can simulate the feeling of language without obeying the typical neurological rules of syntax and vocabulary. One of the key mechanisms here is neural noise amplification. During REM, random neural firing becomes dramatically more intense. Normally, waking consciousness filters out this randomness. In dreams, it doesn't. The brain takes this noise and organizes it into structured experiences, stories, faces, places, and even languages. Another critical factor is working memory suppression. The hippocampus, which normally checks memories against reality, behaves differently during REM. It releases fragments of stored experiences without proper temporal or factual organization. This is why your brain can combine a rhythm from a song you once heard, a phonetic pattern from a foreign film, a tone of voice remembered from childhood, and assemble them into something that feels like a real language. Neurotransmitters play a huge role as well. During REM sleep, acetylcholine levels are extremely high, increasing cortical creativity and sensory vividness. Serotonin and norepinephrine drop sharply, reducing logical coherence and critical judgment. This neurochemical cocktail produces a brain that is highly imaginative, emotionally intense, and unconcerned with factual consistency. In this state, the brain doesn't care if a language is real. It only cares if the experience of meaning feels real. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when people report dreaming in unknown languages, the brain activates the same language regions used in waking speech, but with irregular and fragmented activity patterns. It's not true language. It's a simulation of language circuitry. Your brain is essentially dreaming the concept of communication itself. In the next part, we'll explore real scientific studies and documented cases, moments where researchers recorded this phenomenon and tried to decode what the dreaming mind was truly doing. This phenomenon isn't just a collection of strange anecdotes. It has been observed, analyzed, and quietly studied inside real sleep laboratories. One of the earliest serious investigations into unknown language dreaming came from the Montreal Dream Research Laboratory in the 1980s. Researchers noticed that bilingual subjects occasionally switched languages in their dreams. But more intriguingly, monolingual participants also reported foreign speech experiences, even when exposed to the language only briefly in their waking lives. In several monitored cases, participants were awakened during REM sleep and asked to immediately describe what they had heard or spoken in their dreams. Many couldn't reproduce the words, but they were absolutely certain the language had structure and meaning. This led scientists to identify something called illusory semantic fluency, the sensation of fluency without actual linguistic competence. In 2006, a study published in Consciousness and Cognition explored how the brain creates the feeling of understanding without real comprehension. Participants were exposed to artificial fake languages with consistent rhythm but no meaning. When tested later, many dreamed about speaking those invented languages, with full emotional certainty that they understood them. The brain doesn't need a real language. It only needs a pattern that feels like language. There is also a fascinating set of documented cases involving people exposed to unfamiliar languages during emotionally intense moments. One widely cited neurological case involved a woman who had suffered a mild concussion and later reported recurrent dreams in what she described as structured, unfamiliar speech. When analyzed, her brain scans showed heightened interaction between her right temporal lobe and the limbic system during REM sleep. This suggested the phenomenon wasn't about language itself, but about emotional symbolic processing leaking into language regions of the brain. Even more compelling experiments came from lucid dream laboratories in Germany, where participants trained in lucid dreaming were instructed to attempt speaking unknown languages inside dreams. The result? Many succeeded. But when analyzed, their speech turned out to be phonetic mosaics, blends of languages they had heard in life but never learned. Their brains weren't creating language from nothing. They were recombining scattered fragments of sound, rhythm, memory, and emotion into something that felt whole. Ancient accounts of this phenomenon also exist. Philosophers like Carl Jung and even ancient Greek dream interpreters wrote about the language of dreams, not as speech, but as a symbolic code that feels more real than words. Modern neuroscience now agrees with that ancient intuition. The dreaming brain is not bound by linguistic reality. It only simulates the experience of meaning, and that simulation is so powerful that it convinces the dreamer completely. In the final part, we'll step away from science and reflect on what this phenomenon says about the nature of the human mind, about identity, about language, about the silent voice that speaks when we sleep. When you dream in a language you do not speak, the strangest part is not the sounds themselves. It is the certainty, the quiet, unquestionable feeling that you understood something beyond words. This phenomenon reveals something profound about the human mind. Language does not begin in speech. It begins in meaning. Beneath vocabulary, beneath grammar, beneath culture, there is a deeper layer of cognition where ideas exist without words, where emotions don't need translation, where understanding is instant and silent. Dreams pull us back into that ancient mental state, a place where the brain speaks in rhythm instead of grammar, in emotion instead of syntax, in symbols instead of sentences. When you wake from these dreams, the words disappear, because they were never truly words. They were mental music, structured feelings, symbolic currents pretending to be language. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. The voice you hear in your dreams does not belong to any real language. It belongs to the architecture of your own consciousness. So the next time you hear foreign words in your sleep, don't try to translate them. Ask yourself, What part of you is trying to speak without words?